The morning sun filtered softly through the white curtains of Jane's well-kept kitchen as she stood at the counter, carefully flipping pancakes on the stove. The faint hum of the radio played in the background, mixing with the scent of coffee brewing, creating an atmosphere of domestic serenity. Brian walked in, dressed sharply in his tailored suit, adjusting his cufflinks absent-mindedly. Jane glanced at him, a smile tugging at her lips. "You're up early today," she said lightly, sliding a plate toward him. He responded with a distracted nod, eyes darting to his phone as he typed furiously. It wasn't unusual for Brian to be preoccupied. He was a man with responsibilities. She reminded herself, but lately, there was something more distant in his demeanor. She tried to brush it off, pouring his coffee just the way he liked. "Don't forget to eat, Brian," she added, forcing cheerfulness into her voice. Brian finally looked up, giving her a thin smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thanks, Jane. I'll grab a bite on my way," he said, already standing and collecting his briefcase. Jane's smile faltered slightly. She watched him slip on his watch, the one she gifted him on their 5th anniversary, a memory she clung to, hoping the man she married still existed beneath his recent aloofness. As he headed for the door, she called after him, "Don't push yourself too hard, okay?" He paused briefly, turning back to plant a quick kiss on her forehead, almost mechanical. "I'll be fine," he murmured, then disappeared out the door. Left alone in the quiet kitchen, Jane felt a strange hollowness settle in her chest. Everything appeared perfect, the clean house, the warm breakfast, the picture-perfect life. Yet, an invisible distance loomed between them, one she couldn't quite put her finger on. She shook her head, convincing herself she was overthinking. Brian had always been a hard-working man. Maybe she simply needed to trust him more. Still, as she washed the dishes, that unsettling emptiness lingered like a shadow, silently gnawing at her peace. The days rolled into weeks, and Jane found herself tiptoeing around a silence that seemed to grow thicker with every passing evening. Brian's presence at home had become more fleeting, late-night returns, early morning departures, and barely, their conversations that left Jane feeling like a shadow in her own marriage. She tried to hold on to the little things. The folded shirts she ironed meticulously, the dinners she prepared and left on the dining table, untouched. One evening, as she set 2 plates down, she glanced at the clock. It was past 9. Her phone vibrated, and she snatched it up, hoping it was Brian. The message read, "Caught up at work. Don't wait up." A sigh escaped her lips as she sank into a chair, staring at the untouched meal. The warmth they once shared had dimmed into cold formality. She missed the days when Brian would lean against the counter, teasing her about her overcooked rice or sneaking bites from the pan. The next morning, over breakfast, Jane mustered the courage to bridge the growing gap. "Brian, is everything okay?" "You've seemed distant lately," she asked gently, searching his face for any flicker of sincerity. Brian glanced up briefly from his phone, his expression unreadable. "Work's just been crazy, Jane. You know how it is," he replied, offering a smile that felt rehearsed. Jane nodded, but a tightness gripped her chest. She wanted to believe him, to accept that it was merely stress. Yet, something gnawed at her, the lack of eye contact, the way his fingers tapped impatiently on the table. "Maybe we could take a weekend off soon?" she suggested hopefully. Brian hesitated for a beat too long. "Let's see how things go. I've got some big deals coming up," he said, already standing to grab his jacket. Watching him leave yet again, Jane felt like a guest lingering too long in her own home, trying to decipher when exactly love had turned into polite distance. Later that afternoon, unable to contain the unease swelling within her, Jane found herself dialing her best friend, Amber. It had been months since they'd sat down properly, but Amber always had a way of grounding her. They met at a quiet cafe, Jane stirring her coffee absent-mindedly while Amber observed her with concerned eyes. "You've barely touched your drink, Jane." "Talk to me," Amber urged softly. Jane sighed, glancing around before speaking. "Brian, he's not himself. He's always away, barely talks, and when he does, it feels like he's somewhere else entirely." Amber reached across the table, squeezing Jane's hand. "Marriage isn't always roses, Jane. Maybe he's just under pressure. Men don't always handle stress well," Amber reasoned, her tone gentle but firm. Jane wanted to believe her, clinging to the idea that stress was the culprit. But deep down, something didn't sit right. Jane hesitated before admitting, "It's not just that. I feel like I'm living with a stranger. I can't remember the last time he really looked at me." Amber's brows furrowed as she leaned in. "Listen, I don't want to jump to conclusions, but if you're feeling unsettled, don't ignore it. Just be observant. Don't confront him out of the blue, but pay attention to the little things." Jane nodded slowly, her throat tight. "I just wish I knew how to reach him." Amber smiled faintly, trying to lighten the mood. "Maybe plan something simple, like cooking his favorite dinner. Sometimes men don't even realize how distant they've become." Jane forced a smile, silently wondering if it was really that simple. As they stood to leave, Amber pulled her into a hug. "Whatever happens, I've got you, okay?" Jane felt her eyes sting slightly, grateful for the comfort. But as she walked back to her car, the heaviness in her chest only deepened. That weekend, Jane's younger brother, Danny, dropped by unannounced. His easy smile and playful teasing brought a rare lightness into the house, a stark contrast to the coldness she'd grown accustomed to. "Wow, sis, you've got this place looking like a magazine spread," he joked, glancing around the spotless living room. Jane laughed softly, grateful for his presence. As they chatted over tea, Jane avoided mentioning Brian at first. But as the afternoon wore on and Brian still hadn't returned home, Danny's eyes narrowed slightly. "So, where's the man of the house? Working late again?" he asked casually. Jane hesitated before answering. "Yeah, he's been really busy." Danny didn't press, but Jane could sense his quiet observation, the way he took in the untouched second cup of tea she had poured, the silence that hung too heavily in the air. Later that evening, when Brian finally walked in, offering a curt nod and heading straight to the study, Danny watched him with a subtle furrow of his brow. After Brian disappeared down the hall, Danny leaned toward Jane, lowering his voice. "Is everything all right between you two?" he asked gently. Jane forced a smile, brushing it off. "You know how Brian is, always working." But Danny didn't look convinced. "Jane, I know you. You're trying to hold it together, but don't let anyone make you feel invisible." She swallowed the lump in her throat, shaking her head lightly. "It's nothing, just a phase." Danny placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice steady. "You know I'm here, right? Always." Jane nodded, grateful for his quiet support, but unwilling to admit how much those words settled like a weight in her chest. As she watched Danny leave later that night, a hollow feeling returned, and she couldn't shake the sense that someone else had noticed the cracks she was desperately trying to hide. It was a rushed morning unlike any other. Jane stood at the door, holding Brian's travel bag in one hand, her eyes following him as he frantically searched the house. "Where is it, my suitcase?" he muttered under his breath, clearly flustered. Jane immediately stepped forward, pointing toward the hallway closet. "I put it there last night after you packed. You must have overlooked it." Brian barely glanced her way, grabbing the bag and checking his watch anxiously. "Damn, I'm going to miss my flight," he muttered. Jane moved closer, brushing her hand against his arm. "I could drop you at the airport. It'll save you the trouble of parking." He shook his head quickly. No need. "I'll manage. Just make sure everything's fine here while I'm gone," he said distractedly. She stood in the doorway, watching as he grabbed his keys and darted out without so much as a goodbye kiss. The sense of emptiness gnawed at her as she sighed deeply, convincing herself again that it was just work pressure weighing him down. Minutes after Brian left, Jane walked back into the hallway, noticing something odd. The smaller suitcase he always carried for documents and essentials was still by the stairs. She bent down, opening it slightly, realizing he must have forgotten it in his haste. Without hesitation, she grabbed her car keys and purse, deciding she would take it to him. She reasoned with herself. It was just the kind of supportive wife she'd always been, dependable, thoughtful. Maybe seeing her would soften his mood. Maybe it would bring back some of the warmth that had been missing lately. "I'll surprise him," she murmured to herself, locking the door behind her. The drive to the airport was a blur, her mind buzzing with anticipation. She rehearsed what she'd say, something light, something caring. She imagined Brian's surprised smile when he saw her standing there, luggage in hand, doing what she always did best, being there for him. Little did she know, this seemingly small act would unravel her entire world. Jane hurried through the bustling crowd, her heart pounding as she clutched Brian's suitcase tightly. She glanced at the digital display board, scanning for his flight. Relief washed over her when she realized she still had a few minutes before boarding closed. Navigating through the sea of travelers, she made her way toward the gates, her eyes darting around, searching for his familiar figure. But what she saw next stopped her in her tracks. Just a few feet ahead, she caught sight of Brian, except he wasn't alone. He stood casually beside a tall, elegantly dressed woman, their hands entwined, their posture intimate and unhurried. Jane's breath caught painfully in her throat. Her first instinct was denial. Maybe it wasn't what it seemed. Maybe she had misread the situation. But as she watched Brian lean in close, whispering something into the woman's ear, her world tilted dangerously off its axis. Frozen to the spot, Jane's grip on the suitcase tightened, her heart thudding against her rib cage like a warning drum. The woman laughed softly, brushing Brian's arm affectionately. Jane felt like she was watching a scene unfold in slow motion, as though the floor beneath her had vanished. She wanted to scream, to march up to them and demand answers, but her legs wouldn't move. She felt invisible amidst the blur of strangers rushing past, each oblivious to the shattering betrayal she was witnessing. Suddenly, the boarding announcement echoed through the terminal, and Brian casually handed over their boarding passes to the attendant, both tickets. Jane's eyes followed them numbly as they walked away, Brian's arm protectively around the woman's waist, as if they were embarking on a shared adventure. She stood there, rooted to the spot, her chest tightening painfully. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't harmless. Something deeper, more deliberate was unfolding, and she was only just beginning to see its edge. Jane remained standing in the middle of the bustling terminal, unable to tear her gaze away from Brian and the woman disappearing toward the boarding gate. Her mind raced, attempting to rationalize what she had just witnessed. She blinked rapidly, forcing herself to move, to follow at a distance. Slowly edging closer to the boarding area, her eyes flicked to the tickets Brian had handed the attendant. A sliver of paper fluttered to the floor near where they'd been standing. She hesitated, glancing around before stooping to pick it up. Her fingers trembled as she read it. A one-way ticket. Her breath caught in her throat, her pulse quickening. One way, not round trip. She clutched the paper tightly, her mind spinning. Why a one-way ticket? Why leave without a plan to return? The implications crashed down like waves. Was Brian planning to leave for good? Without her? Staggering back from the gate, Jane felt her knees weaken. The truth clawed at her insides. Brian wasn't just distracted or overworked. He had deliberately planned this escape, boarding a flight with another woman while she stood clueless, devotedly holding the suitcase he forgot. Her throat felt dry, her chest heaving as she fought back the swell of emotion. The boarding call rang out again, slicing through her thoughts like a cruel reminder. She glanced once more in their direction, watching them vanish into the tunnel, laughing, completely unaware of her presence. Swallowing hard, she turned away, her steps heavy as she exited the terminal. Tears threatened to spill, but she forced herself to stay composed, her mind now a whirlwind of confusion and pain. The signs had been there all along. And now, staring at that one-way ticket in her trembling hand, Jane realized she was standing at the edge of a betrayal far deeper than she had imagined. Jane sat at the edge of their neatly made bed that evening, the silence of the house suffocating. The one-way ticket, crumpled in her hand, felt like a physical weight, burning against her palm. Her eyes drifted to Brian's side of the closet, still filled with his clothes, as if nothing was amiss. But her gut twisted with unease. She needed answers. Her mind raced back to the subtle changes, Brian's coldness, the hurried departures. On impulse, she pulled out her tablet and logged into their joint bank account, something she rarely did because Brian usually managed their finances. As she navigated the familiar interface, her eyes widened. Several large withdrawals, thousands of dollars, had been made in the last few weeks, transferred to an unfamiliar account. She scrolled further, finding credit card purchases she didn't recognize. Jewelry stores, luxury travel agencies, expensive dining bills. Jane felt her pulse hammer in her ears. Her fingers hovered over her phone before she finally called Amber. Amber, I need to ask you something, she began, trying to keep her voice steady. Is it normal for a spouse to transfer large amounts without mentioning it? There was a pause on the other end before Amber's cautious voice replied, Jane. No. What's going on? Jane exhaled shakily, running a hand through her hair. I checked our accounts. Brian's been draining money. I didn't even notice until now. Amber's voice grew firmer. Jane, this isn't normal. Something's not right. Do not let this slide. Jane swallowed hard, her stomach tightening. The evidence was staring her in the face. This wasn't careless behavior. It was calculated. She felt her throat tighten as she whispered, He's hiding something, and I don't even know where to begin. The words tasted bitter, but they hung in the air like a harsh truth she could no longer ignore. The following afternoon, Jane met Amber again, this time not in a casual cafe, but in the privacy of Amber's living room, her emotions barely held together. She relayed the events at the airport, Brian's withdrawal patterns, and the heavy silence that had blanketed their marriage for months. Amber listened intently, her brows knitted in concern. Jane, she said carefully, you need to protect yourself now. This isn't just him being distant. This is premeditated. He's planning something, and it doesn't include you. Jane's throat tightened at the raw truth in Amber's voice. But what should I do? I can't confront him outright. He'll deny everything, Jane murmured, feeling trapped. Amber leaned forward, lowering her voice. Listen to me. Before you make any moves, freeze the joint accounts. Quietly. Don't alert him yet. If he's draining funds, you need to cut that off. Jane bit her lip, uncertainty swirling in her chest. What if I'm overreacting? She whispered, but Amber shook her head firmly. Jane, no, I know you. You've tolerated more than enough. And if those accounts get emptied, where does that leave you? Amber reached for her friend's hands, her tone softening. You don't have to confront him today, but you can take back some control. Protect yourself before it's too late. Jane nodded slowly, the resolve starting to harden inside her. I'll talk to the bank tomorrow, quietly. Amber gave her a reassuring squeeze. I'll be with you every step of the way. You're not alone in this. As Jane left Amber's house, her mind buzzed with unease, but also a faint spark of determination. The time for being passive was over. It was time to prepare herself, piece by piece, for the storm ahead. Later that evening, Jane couldn't shake the hollow ache in her chest. She sat on her couch, staring at her phone until her brother's name flashed across the screen. Without hesitation, she picked up. Danny, she greeted softly, her voice thinner than she intended. You don't sound like yourself, Danny observed immediately, his concern palpable. After a moment's hesitation, Jane exhaled. Can you come by tomorrow? There's something I need to talk to you about. True to his word, Danny showed up the next day, and Jane wasted no time laying out the events, the distant Brian, the airport, the unexplained transactions. Danny's face darkened as she spoke. Jane, this isn't just marriage problems. This is betrayal. And if Brian's moving money without your knowledge, that's not something to overlook. Jane watched as her brother's jaw clenched, his protective instincts kicking in. Leave the digging to me, he said firmly. I'll look into where those funds are going. He's covering something up, and I intend to find out. Jane's eyes welled slightly, the weight finally too much. I feel so stupid, Danny. How did I not see this coming? Danny shook his head, leaning forward. You trusted him. That's not stupidity, that's love. But now, you have to be smart. Let me handle the digging. You focus on keeping your ground. Jane nodded slowly, feeling a fragile relief settle in her chest. Someone was finally standing beside her, ready to help peel back the layers Brian had so carefully constructed. As Danny left with a determined stride, Jane felt the first glimmer of control returning to her, though the ache of betrayal still burned beneath the surface. Days passed, but Jane's mind remained restless, each minute stretching long with questions left unanswered. The weight of Brian's betrayal gnawed at her, yet she knew she couldn't confront him recklessly, not without unraveling the careful steps she and Danny were taking. Still, the urge to hear his voice, to test his lies, became unbearable. She grabbed her phone one evening, her fingers trembling slightly as she dialed his number. It rang longer than usual before he finally picked up, his tone as composed as ever. "Jane," he greeted, his voice smooth but distant. "Everything all right?" Jane swallowed hard, willing herself to stay calm. "I just wanted to check in," she replied, forcing a softness she didn't feel. "You've been away longer than usual. How's the business trip going?" There was a pause, brief, but enough to make her pulse quicken. Brian cleared his throat. "Busy. Meetings back to back. You know how it is." His words rolled off too easily, too rehearsed. Jane's grip on her phone tightened. "When do you think you'll be back?" she asked casually, pretending not to know the truth. He hesitated for a fraction too long. "Not sure yet. Might have to extend for another week. Things are complicated." Jane forced a smile into her voice. "Well, don't overwork yourself." Brian chuckled lightly, the sound hollow. "You know me, always working." As the call ended, Jane stared at the blank screen, bile rising in her throat. Every word had been carefully measured, a script he must have rehearsed countless times. She felt both shattered and furious how easily he lied, unaware she'd seen everything. But now his lies only fueled her resolve. She would not let him slip away unnoticed. Not anymore. The following day, Danny arrived, his expression grim and determined. He sat across from Jane at her dining table, a folder clutched in his hand. "I've been digging," he began, sliding the folder toward her. "And you need to see this." Jane opened it slowly, scanning through photos and documents. Each page made her stomach twist tighter. Pictures of Brian and the woman from the airport, Erica, surfaced from different dates, different places, spanning over a year. Dinner dates, vacations, even real estate meetings. Danny's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. "Her name's Erica. She's not some random fling, Jane. She's been in his life for a while. He's been laying groundwork. I also found proof they've been making plans to move abroad together." Jane stared at the photos, her hands trembling slightly. "So all this time," she whispered, her voice cracking. Danny nodded solemnly. "He's been 2 steps ahead, hiding it well. They've been purchasing property under a different name, one that links back to him through a series of shell accounts." Jane felt her throat tighten painfully. "He planned to leave me, start over with her." Danny reached for her hand, his grip firm. "But not without draining everything first. You freezing the accounts was the right move." Tears burned Jane's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Instead, she inhaled shakily. "He built a new life while I stood by him blindly." Danny's expression softened. "It's not your fault. But now you know. And now you're in control." Jane nodded slowly, her heart breaking all over again, but with each painful truth, her clarity sharpened. The next morning, Jane sat at her bank's office, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She had barely slept, replaying the photos and documents Danny had uncovered over and over in her mind. Every piece of evidence confirmed one thing. Brian was systematically cutting her out of his life while stripping away everything she'd built with him. As the banker looked over her request to freeze the joint accounts, Jane kept her tone steady. "I'd like to temporarily halt all withdrawals and transfers from these accounts," she explained, masking the storm raging inside her. The banker glanced up, eyebrows raised. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Lawson?" Jane offered a polite, almost indifferent smile. "Just a precaution. Family matters." Once the necessary forms were signed, Jane stepped out of the bank, her heart pounding but her steps deliberate. She called Amber immediately, her voice low. "It's done. The accounts are frozen." Amber exhaled on the other end. "Good. You've taken the first step, Jane. He won't see this coming." Jane's gaze drifted to the distant horizon as she whispered, "I trusted him with everything, Amber, and he nearly took it all." Amber's voice softened, but he didn't. "You're 1 step ahead now." As Jane ended the call, she felt a quiet resolve settle in her chest. There was still much to face, but for the first time in weeks, she wasn't standing still. She was no longer waiting to be blindsided, she was reclaiming control, one move at a time. It didn't take long before Jane's phone buzzed, Brian's name flashing across the screen. Her heart pounded, but she steadied herself before answering. "Jane!" Brian's voice barked sharply, barely masking his agitation. "Why are the accounts frozen? I tried accessing funds and everything's blocked. What's going on?" Jane kept her tone calm, deceptively sweet. "Oh, I thought it might be best to secure things while you're away. You've been gone so long, and I've noticed unusual transactions. It's just precautionary." For a moment, there was silence on the other end, as if he was recalibrating his response. Then came the forced laugh. "Jane, you're being paranoid. Those transactions? Business-related. You know how these deals work." She pressed her lips together, her voice steady. "I'm sure. But until you return, the accounts will stay as they are. It's better to be safe." Brian's tone hardened, the edge unmistakable. "You've crossed a line, Jane. This isn't how we operate. Unfreezing them immediately would be the smart thing to do." Jane clenched her jaw, swallowing the hurt and anger bubbling within her. "I'm sure you'll manage," she said coolly, then ended the call before he could retaliate further. Her hands trembled slightly as she set the phone down, but she refused to second-guess herself. No more meek compliance. Amber called minutes later, her voice cautious. "Did he find out?" Jane exhaled shakily. "He did, and he's furious." Amber's voice filled with reassurance. "Good, let him be. He's realizing you're no longer under his thumb." Jane stood by the window, staring out into the distance, her heart still heavy, but fueled by the knowledge that she had finally disrupted Brian's carefully laid plans. A few days later, Jane's phone rang again, but this time it was an unfamiliar number. Curious yet cautious, she answered, only to be met with a voice that sent a chill down her spine. "Jane Lawson, isn't it?" The woman's tone was laced with condescension, smooth but sharp. "I'm Erica. I believe we've met." Indirectly. Jane felt her throat tighten, but she remained silent, letting the woman continue. "I figured it was time we spoke, woman to woman. I've heard you've been meddling, freezing accounts, making things difficult for Brian." Jane's grip on the phone tightened, her voice icy. "I'm only protecting what's mine." Erica laughed lightly, the sound insincere. "Oh, darling, what's yours? Brian's been mine long before you noticed. He's just been too polite to tell you." Jane swallowed, refusing to let the hurt show. "If you think taunting me makes you stronger, you're mistaken," she replied evenly. But Erica's voice only grew more smug. "It's not taunting. I'm simply letting you know Brian has no plans of coming back. He's building a new life. You're just collateral." The call ended before Jane could reply, leaving her staring at the blank screen, her heart pounding with humiliation and rage. The cruelty of Erica's words cut deeper than she wanted to admit. But rather than crumble, Jane inhaled deeply, forcing the sting back. If Erica thought she'd won, she was sorely mistaken. Jane's eyes glinted with a quiet fire. They had underestimated her, both of them. And that would be their greatest mistake. The following weekend, Jane received a call she'd been dreading, Brian's mother. "Jane, I've been hearing things." The older woman's voice came sharp over the line. "What's going on with the accounts? Brian called, said you've frozen everything. What nonsense is this?" Jane closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself. "It's a financial matter, Mrs. Lawson. Nothing for you to worry about." But Brian's mother wouldn't be pacified so easily. "You've always managed the home. Why are you suddenly making trouble? Brian's got enough stress with work. Now you're adding to it?" Jane swallowed the lump forming in her throat. Years of playing the dutiful daughter-in-law flashed before her. Always polite, always respectful. But today, something snapped inside her. "With all due respect, Mrs. Lawson, you may want to ask Brian why he's been transferring large sums to accounts I've never seen." There was a pause, followed by a sharp intake of breath. "Jane, marriages have rough patches. You shouldn't air your dirty laundry or make rash decisions." Jane's tone remained calm, but there was steel beneath it. "I've kept quiet long enough. Whatever Brian's told you, ask him for the full story." After the call ended, Jane sat down heavily, her heart pounding. It stung, knowing she would be painted as the troublemaker even among family. But she refused to keep covering for Brian. Later that day, Danny stopped by, immediately sensing her mood. "Let me guess, they're blaming you now?" Jane nodded, her voice brittle. "Of course, I've disrupted their perfect image." Danny placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "Let them talk. Truth has a way of unraveling everything, Jane. Stay strong." And though her heart ached, she knew he was right. She was done defending lies. It had been a sleepless night for Jane, her mind plagued by the weight of recent events. The cold words from Brian's mother, Erica's taunting call, and Brian's own fury had worn on her nerves like sandpaper. Wanting to clear her head, she absent-mindedly moved through their bedroom, straightening the space. Her hands paused when she reached Brian's study table, where a familiar leather folder lay half open. A flicker of curiosity stirred, prompting her to pull it closer. As she flipped through the neatly stacked documents, her heart nearly stopped. There, tucked between papers, sat unsigned divorce papers. Her eyes scanned the pages, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The papers had been prepared months ago, but never filed, Brian's signature glaringly absent, yet Jane's name printed boldly under respondent. Her fingers trembled as she set the documents down, bile rising in her throat. So, he hadn't even intended to have a conversation. No discussion, no explanation. Just paperwork ready, as if their years together amounted to little more than a transaction waiting to be finalized. Jane slumped into the chair, her pulse pounding. She wanted to scream, to tear the papers apart, but instead she sat in stunned silence, the betrayal washing over her in fresh waves. Later that afternoon, she called Amber, her voice hollow. "Amber, I found divorce papers. They've been ready for months." There was a long pause before Amber's voice softened. "I'm so sorry, Jane, but now you know exactly where he stands. You need to decide where you stand." Jane nodded, gripping the phone tightly. For all the shock and pain, one thing had crystallized. Brian had planned to discard her quietly. But she would not let herself be discarded so easily. Determined to understand just how deep Brian's deception ran, Jane met with Danny again the following evening. He arrived carrying a thick envelope, his expression dark. "I found something else," he said without preamble, taking a seat across from her. Jane's stomach tightened as she watched him lay out property records, financial statements, and transaction slips. Danny leaned forward, his tone grim. "Brian sold the house you inherited from Aunt Clara." Jane's breath hitched. "That house. It's in my name," she whispered, shock radiating through her. Danny nodded tightly. "It was, but a few months ago he forged documents, claimed joint ownership, and sold it. The money went into offshore accounts tied to a dummy corporation, one connected to him." Jane's hands trembled as she sifted through the damning evidence. "He sold my family's home without telling me?" Her voice cracked, the betrayal sinking deeper than she thought possible. Danny's jaw clenched. "He didn't just plan to leave, Jane. He planned to leave you with nothing." She shook her head, her throat burning. "How long has he been planning this?" Danny's eyes softened slightly. "Longer than you realized. But now you have the proof. Every move he made, every cent he tried to siphon off, there's a trail." Jane swallowed hard, staring down at the records that laid bare the extent of Brian's betrayal. The house had been a symbol of security, of family, and now even that was gone. But the ache in her chest slowly turned into something colder, steadier, a quiet resolve. He had taken enough from her, no more. Jane waited until Danny had left before the weight of everything she'd uncovered collapsed onto her shoulders. She wandered aimlessly through the silent house, her fingers brushing the edges of picture frames, familiar corners, all once filled with laughter and shared dreams. Now they felt hollow, stripped of meaning. The documents Danny had given her lay untouched on the kitchen table, but they burned in her mind. Slowly, her steps faltered, and she sank onto the floor, unable to hold back the tears anymore. Her sobs racked her body, the pain she'd been trying to control finally finding its way out. She clutched her knees to her chest, the quiet walls bearing witness to her unraveling. Every betrayal, every lie, every calculated move Brian had made replayed like a cruel montage. It was well into the night when Amber arrived, her voice soft as she knocked and let herself in. She found Jane crumpled on the floor, her eyes swollen, her body shaking. Without a word, Amber dropped beside her, pulling her into a tight embrace. "Let it out, Jane," she murmured. "You've been holding it in too long." Jane buried her face in her friend's shoulder, the tears relentless. "I gave him everything, Amber. My love, my trust. And he sold everything behind my back." Amber held her tighter, her voice firm yet gentle. "You don't have to be strong right now. You're allowed to break, but I need you to remember this is not where your story ends." As Jane clung to her, the weight didn't fully lift, but for the first time, she realized she wasn't completely alone. And slowly, beneath the ache, the flicker of something stronger began to stir. The next morning, Jane woke to the dull ache of exhaustion pulling at her bones. The house, though familiar, felt colder now, stripped of comfort. She sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the stack of documents Danny had left behind, her mind replaying every discovery. Yet something had shifted overnight. Beneath the remnants of grief was a steady pulse of determination, faint but undeniable. She couldn't crumble forever. Brian had already taken too much. She reached for her phone, scrolling through her contacts until her finger hovered over the name of a law firm she'd heard Amber mention once. Without giving herself time to hesitate, she dialed, her voice calm but steady as she requested an appointment. "I need legal advice," she said plainly, her throat tight but unwavering. "It's urgent." Later that afternoon, she sat across from the lawyer, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She laid everything bare. Brian's financial manipulations, the forged sale of her property, the joint accounts, and the divorce papers she had discovered. The lawyer listened attentively before leaning forward, his tone firm. "Jane, you're not powerless. You've done the right thing freezing the accounts. Now we'll proceed to secure your assets legally." He explained the steps, filing an emergency financial injunction, gathering all the evidence into a case that would protect her interests. Jane nodded slowly, the gears in her mind clicking into place. For the first time in weeks, she felt something resembling control returning to her. When she walked out of the office that evening, the ache in her chest remained, but there was a fresh steadiness in her step. Brian may have thought she'd stay broken, but she was quietly, deliberately preparing her counterattack. The following week was a flurry of silent preparation. Jane worked closely with her lawyer, gathering every document, every receipt, every shred of proof of Brian's financial deceit. She sat for hours reviewing bank statements, transaction records, and property sales, making sure nothing slipped through the cracks. Each piece of evidence added another layer to her case, building a wall Brian wouldn't be able to climb over. At the lawyer's office, she signed off on the injunction papers, ensuring he couldn't touch the remaining assets. "Once we file these," the lawyer informed her, "he'll be served notice immediately. There will be no room left for him to maneuver." That evening, she met with Amber and Danny at her house, the weight of her actions still sinking in. Danny glanced over the documents she'd finalized, his expression proud yet protective. "You've done the right thing, Jane. He'll have no idea what's coming." Amber nodded in agreement, squeezing Jane's hand. "You've played this smart, quiet, controlled, and now he'll feel it." Jane offered a faint smile, the exhaustion still pressing heavily on her, but her resolve remained firm. "I don't want him to have the satisfaction of thinking he's in control anymore," she murmured. Amber leaned forward, her tone soft but fierce. "You've taken back your power. Whatever happens next, remember that." Jane sat back, staring out the window into the night. The pieces were finally moving in her favor, and she was ready for the next storm. It wasn't entirely planned, but fate seemed to have a cruel sense of timing. One afternoon, Jane walked into a boutique she frequented, hoping for a brief distraction. She didn't expect to see Erica there, laughing with the shop attendant, browsing through the latest collection. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither woman looked away. Erica's smirk spread slowly, almost daring. Without hesitation, Jane approached, her pulse steady despite the surge of emotion. "Fancy seeing you here," Jane said, her voice calm but sharp-edged. Erica tilted her head, feigning politeness. "Well, this town is small, isn't it?" Her eyes glittered with mockery. "Brian's told me so much about you." Jane's lips curved into a cold smile. "I'm sure he has, but I wonder if he's told you everything." Erica's expression flickered just briefly. Jane leaned in slightly, her voice low. "Tell him when you see him, he might want to check his accounts and his legal mail." Erica's eyes narrowed, the amusement draining from her face. "What are you playing at?" she asked coolly, but Jane remained unshaken. "No games, just making sure everyone knows where they stand." Without giving Erica the satisfaction of a reaction, Jane turned and walked away, her heels clicking confidently against the floor. The encounter left her heart racing, but she didn't falter. For once, she'd left Erica unsettled, and that small victory felt like the first breath after drowning. Jane stood at her living room window one quiet afternoon, the sunlight casting long shadows on the polished floor. She hadn't heard from Brian since the injunction was filed, nor had she expected to. But as if summoned by the shifting winds, she glanced outside and caught sight of a familiar car pulling into the driveway. Her stomach clenched, but she steeled herself, watching as Brian stepped out, his movements sharp, almost frantic. Moments later, the front door swung open without a knock, and there he stood, looking less composed than she'd ever seen him. "Jane," he snapped, barely disguising his frustration, "we need to talk. Now." She turned calmly, arms folded across her chest. "I figured you might show up once the money dried up," she said evenly. Brian's eyes flashed, pacing as he ran a hand through his hair. "What is all this? Freezing accounts, lawyers? Are you trying to ruin me?" he demanded. Jane's lips curved into a faint, unbothered smile. "I'm simply protecting myself. Something you failed to consider while planning your exit." He scoffed, trying to regain his composure. "Look, whatever you think you've done, it won't last. This is over the top." Jane walked closer, her voice low but firm. "You forged my signature, sold my property, drained our accounts, and prepared to leave me behind like old baggage. So, Brian, don't stand here pretending to be the victim." His face paled slightly at her bluntness. For the first time, he realized the woman before him wasn't the one he left weeks ago, and it unnerved him more than he was willing to admit. The silence between them stretched thin until Jane broke it, her tone sharper than Brian remembered. "Sit," she instructed coolly, motioning to the chair. Begrudgingly, he complied, his jaw tight. Jane slid a folder across the table. "Here are my terms," she said flatly. Brian flipped it open, scanning the documents, property agreements, asset divisions, financial statements. His brow furrowed deeper with every line. "You're serious," he muttered. Jane nodded. "Dead serious. I'm not here to beg or fight. I'm here to end this on my terms, not yours." Brian leaned back, attempting a smirk that didn't quite land. "You think you can dictate how this goes?" She met his gaze without flinching. "No, Brian, I know I can." For a moment, he seemed to search for the woman he thought he left behind, the one who used to yield, to forgive easily, but she wasn't there. "Sign those papers," Jane continued, voice crisp, "and consider this chapter closed. You walk away with nothing more. You don't contest, you don't drag it out." Brian scoffed, but couldn't hide the uncertainty creeping into his expression. "And if I refuse," Jane leaned forward, eyes glinting cold, "then I'll make sure every illegal move you made is laid bare, publicly." The words hung heavy in the air, leaving Brian visibly rattled. She stood tall, reclaiming what dignity and strength he had tried to strip away. This was no longer his game to control, and he finally understood that. The door clicked shut behind Brian hours later, leaving Jane alone in the quiet of her living room. Her body trembled slightly, the weight of the confrontation settling heavily in her chest. But before the emptiness could swallow her, she heard a knock, and moments later, Amber and Danny stepped in, their concerned faces scanning hers. "How did it go?" Danny asked, already sensing the exhaustion etched into her features. Jane exhaled slowly, sinking into the couch. "He didn't see it coming," she murmured. Amber sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "You stood your ground. That's what matters." Danny handed her a glass of water, his voice steady. "Whatever happens next, you've got us. No more carrying this weight alone." Jane's throat tightened, emotions swirling beneath the surface. "I never thought I'd have to be this person," she admitted softly. Amber squeezed her hand. "You didn't choose this, but you're stronger for it." Jane glanced between them, their unwavering support anchoring her. For so long, she'd felt like she was standing on sinking ground, but now, with Amber's loyalty and Danny's protective strength beside her, she realized she was no longer standing alone. And slowly, the heaviness in her chest lifted, replaced by the faintest glimmer of hope. Days after Brian's visit, Jane sat quietly in her lawyer's office, finalizing the last pieces of documentation. She had no intention of making her private ordeal public, until news reached her desk that Brian was subtly trying to shift the narrative. Whispered rumors circulated through mutual acquaintances and Brian's family, painting Jane as the irrational, controlling wife. It was the final straw. With her lawyer's guidance, Jane moved forward, filing formal legal notices highlighting the forgery, unauthorized sales, and financial misconduct. Not long after, the news broke. Headlines circulated discreetly at first, but soon whispers grew into full-blown discussions. Corporate circles and social groups began questioning Brian's integrity, and former business partners distanced themselves. Jane remained composed as Amber forwarded her an article one afternoon. "Thought you might want to see how the truth's unraveling," Amber's message read. Jane glanced through it, facts laid bare, no exaggerations, just cold, hard details. Later that evening, Danny stopped by, his voice almost amused. "Funny how quickly people turn their backs when the mask slips," he remarked. Jane gave a faint smile, her heart steady but not gloating. "I didn't do it for revenge," she murmured. "I just wanted the truth to stand on its own." Danny nodded approvingly. "And it's standing tall now." The quiet vindication wasn't something she celebrated loudly, but deep down she felt lighter, knowing Brian's carefully woven lies were no longer intact. It wasn't long before Jane heard the inevitable. Erica had left. The news reached her subtly, through one of Brian's former colleagues, who mentioned in passing that Brian had been seen alone, looking disheveled and hollow-eyed. Jane hadn't expected it to affect her, but there was a strange sense of closure in knowing Erica's loyalty had unraveled as soon as Brian's facade crumbled. Over coffee one afternoon, Amber brought it up. "Looks like Erica vanished when the money did," she said, raising an eyebrow. Jane offered a quiet smile, shaking her head. "I guess loyalty isn't part of her vocabulary." There was no satisfaction in it, only a strange, bittersweet acknowledgement of how empty their betrayal truly was. Later, Jane received an unexpected call from one of Brian's family members, cautiously informing her that Brian was struggling, both financially and personally. Jane listened politely but felt no urge to offer sympathy. After the call ended, she sat by her window, the soft hum of evening settling around her. Danny arrived soon after, sensing her quiet mood. "They're all realizing what you already knew," he said simply. Jane nodded, her voice soft. "It's not about watching him fall. It's about finally being free of the weight I carried because of him." She stood, inhaling deeply. The life she once shared with Brian was behind her now, its illusions dismantled piece by piece, and she had no intention of looking back. The day the final divorce papers were signed felt strangely calm. Jane sat across from her lawyer, pen in hand, her signature steady as she finalized the last document that legally severed her ties with Brian. There were no dramatic confrontations, no parting words, just the crisp sound of papers shuffling, marking the end of a painful chapter. As she stepped out of the office, the sunlight seemed warmer, the air lighter. She drove home in silence, allowing herself to breathe, to feel the weight finally lift from her chest. There were no more battles left to fight. She had taken back her name, her dignity, and her life. That evening, Amber and Danny gathered at her house, both sensing the shift in her energy. Jane poured wine for the three of them, her smile genuine, though tinged with exhaustion. "It's done," she announced simply, raising her glass. Amber's eyes softened. "You fought harder than most people ever have, Jane. And you did it with grace." Danny nodded, clinking his glass with hers. "You didn't just survive, you came out stronger." Jane leaned back, a quiet peace settling over her. "I didn't think I'd feel this, free," she admitted. The room filled with warmth and laughter, not loud or wild, but comforting. For the first time in a long while, Jane allowed herself to fully relax, knowing her story hadn't ended in defeat, but in quiet, undeniable victory. Weeks passed quietly, and for the first time in years, Jane found herself waking up without that familiar heaviness pressing against her chest. The house, once filled with memories that haunted her, now felt like a clean slate. She'd taken time to slowly rearrange things, not just furniture, but her life. One morning, as she stood by the window sipping tea, Amber arrived, her face bright. "I've signed us up for that pottery class you always talked about," Amber grinned, handing her a flyer. Jane laughed softly, surprised. "Pottery? I barely have the patience for that." Amber winked. "That's the point. It's time to do things you never had time for." Jane folded the flyer thoughtfully, realizing how long she'd neglected herself. Later that afternoon, Danny dropped by, bringing her a stack of travel brochures. "I thought you could use a change of scenery," he said casually, flipping through pages of serene beaches and quiet towns. Jane smiled, touched by his thoughtfulness. "You two really aren't giving me a chance to settle into boredom, are you?" Danny leaned back, giving her a knowing look. "You've spent so long tied to someone else's plans, Jane. Now's your turn." She glanced at the brochures, her heart swelling, not because of the destinations, but because for once the road ahead felt like hers to choose. The months of chaos had cleared, and now the quiet hum of possibility whispered in the background. Slowly, gently, Jane allowed herself to start imagining life beyond survival. Exactly a year later, Jane stood in the middle of the same bustling airport where everything had once unraveled. But this time, the woman staring at the departure board was no longer uncertain, no longer burdened by heartbreak. She clutched her ticket in hand, her suitcase beside her, her heart light. Dressed comfortably, with her hair tied loosely, Jane radiated quiet confidence. Amber's voice echoed in her ear from a recent call. "Send me photos the moment you land," while Danny had texted her that morning, reminding her to relax and enjoy. As she moved through the terminal, memories flickered of that painful day when betrayal had stood only feet away. But now, the weight of those memories felt like distant echoes, unable to touch her. Settling into her seat near the gate, Jane glanced out at the planes taxiing across the runway, a faint smile on her lips. Her trip wasn't about escape. It was a journey she had chosen on her terms. No longer chasing after anyone, no longer sacrificing herself for someone else's comfort. A soft chime signaled boarding, and as she stood, a sense of calm washed over her. One last glance around the terminal, then she walked forward, her steps steady, unburdened, free. Life hadn't ended when Brian left. In fact, it had only begun. She wasn't the woman he underestimated anymore. She was her own. And as she boarded her flight, Jane knew she was no longer defined by who left, but by how she rose. Here's the Bible verse, Proverbs 31, verse 25. "She is clothed with strength and dignity, and she laughs without fear of the future." Explanation. This verse perfectly mirrors Jane's journey. Despite betrayal, heartbreak, and manipulation, she rises with strength and dignity, reclaiming her life and walking forward without fear. This story shows how, like the Proverbs 31 woman, Jane discovers her worth not in another person, but within herself. Moral of the story: your worth is not defined by stays or who leaves, but by the strength you find when standing alone. Trust, once broken, reveals more than betrayal. It unveils who you truly are when you choose to rebuild. Reflection. The story teaches that no matter how deep the betrayal, self-worth and dignity should never be compromised. Jane's quiet resilience shows readers the power of reclaiming control, setting boundaries, and walking away not bitter, but wiser and freer. It highlights the importance of surrounding oneself with genuine support, and how sometimes the end of one chapter marks the beginning of true freedom and self-discovery. That's the end of the story. What did you learn from this story? Drop your thoughts in the comment section. Leave a like and don't forget to subscribe and turn on post notification so that you'll be notified whenever we drop our next videos. Also, share this video to someone who might be interested. Thank you so much for watching.